Okay, let's start. So welcome everyone to our Mutual Aid Legal Cafe, a teach-in and legal advice for folks with questions about mutual aid. I'm Tia. I use she and her pronouns, and I work at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. I'm the Director of Legal Education, and that means I organize and host these Resilient Communities legal cafes. Before the coronavirus, we used to host these legal cafes 3 times a month in community spaces all over the Bay Area. And often we'd have a teach-in like this one. And then we'd pair attendees with lawyers so that they could get legal advice on starting their own worker cooperative, nonprofit, housing co-op, or other social enterprise. This is a special legal cafe and it's only about mutual aid. But before going further into that, I'll let Charlotte and Sarah introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Charlotte Tsui, and I am a staff attorney at the Law Center. I help primarily immigrant cooperatives and do assist with cooperative conversions as well. And I'm excited to be here to share what we know. As far as I'm concerned, I'll be discussing how nonprofits can be a good intermediary for these mutual aid efforts.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Kaplan. I am an attorney on the team at Cutting Edge Counsel, also known as Cutting Edge Capital, which is a law firm based in Oakland that does a lot of community capital work and helps clients raise capital. And I spend a lot of my time helping cooperatives. I am licensed in California and Illinois, and I live in St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm excited that the legal cafes are on Zoom because I can come now.
Awesome, thank you. Charlotte, would you mind sharing the link to our slide presentation to the chat room?
I can do that.
Thank you so much. Okay, awesome. So if you're staying for the Q&A portion, please fill out our intake form. I sent out an intake form about 30 minutes ago to everyone who RSVP'd. And again, this is a special legal cafe. Instead of having individualized consultations at the end where you have like a confidential legal advice session with lawyers, this time we're going to have breakout rooms where a bunch of lawyers will be with a bunch of people with questions because there are so many of you. So just keep that in mind. And let's work on the presentation about mutual aid. What is mutual aid? Mutual aid in practice and charity often look the same. You see a person in need, you want to help them, and so you do. But the politics of mutual aid and charity are very different. While charity protects the current power imbalance, mutual aid challenges it. And mutual aid comes from the understanding that if we want people to be able to change the status quo with us, then we first need to help each other meet our basic needs. Mutual aid is not all of these things. Quid pro quo transactions, only for disasters like the coronavirus. Charity or a way to save people. A reason for a social safety net not to exist. And we got this from a really useful toolkit. The link is in the slides called Mutual Aid 101. So we're just gonna go over some examples of mutual aid. You might remember that before shelter in place was ordered, there were concerns about closing schools because sometimes children's only meal comes from schools. And what you might not have known is that the USDA program that provides free lunch to students wouldn't have existed if it weren't for a mutual aid project that was organized by the Black Panthers Party. It was called the Breakfast Program, and they served 20,000 children across 19 cities. And they all received free breakfast before going to school. And it was a program that basically shamed the federal government into expanding the USDA program so that all students can have free school meals. Another example of mutual aid is Food Not Bombs. They're actually celebrating their 40th anniversary this month, and they cook and distribute vegan food. Another example is the Transgender Gender Variant Intersex Justice Project. They are an organization run by and for trans folks in prison, or trans folks who were formerly imprisoned. They have harm reduction programs, legal advocates, a member-created newsletter, and a grassroots reentry program with a political education component. Lots of mutual aid projects have emerged in response to the coronavirus. This database has a list of nearly 300 local mutual aid groups. Again, the link to this is in the slides. There's also new maps. This map has nearly 800 mutual aid groups listed. Some groups are self-organizing through Google Sheets. I actually used one of these. It was a Google Sheet organized by people in LA, and my mom is disabled and she lives in LA, and I couldn't get food to her because there's like a 1-week wait on Instacart. And so I just text messaged somebody who volunteered to pick up groceries, and within 3 minutes they said that they could do it, and it was super easy to get help from my mom. Some groups are doing matchmaking, so they're collecting information from volunteers and people in need, and then they pair them together, usually based on how close you live with each other. There are also new hyperlocal groups. This one, called the Alice Street Mutual Aid Group, is specifically for neighbors around the 14th and Alice Streets in Oakland. There's also a bunch of new community-wide associations. And this one is the Berkeley Mutual Aid Network, which is an example of a fiscally sponsored project. We'll talk about this model later. They are a project of the Berkeley Disaster Prep Neighborhood Network, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. And then there's also new platforms to make it easier to help each other out. So after this teach-in, hopefully we'll all learn the moral of the story, which will be that it's easier for organizations to facilitate peer-to-peer aid instead of holding money and then distributing it. But if resources do flow through an organization, it's easiest to go through a 501c3 nonprofit because they have the fewest compliance hurdles and costs with regard to financial regulations and taxes. Decision-making is important. We suggest drafting a 1 to 2 page operating agreement to start. Be sure to include a conflict resolution plan. Waivers and disclaimers are also important. And finally, sometimes clients are better off not listening to their lawyers. Our friends at Movement Generation say that if it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. And so we're just here to tell you what the laws are. Listen to the fish. So what are the laws? Here's a typical mutual aid model. Folks form a group, they pool resources, and then make the resources available to people who need it. The problem with this model is that it triggers a bunch of laws, including money transmission laws, tax laws, securities laws, finance lender laws, and other financial regulations. And I know you're not supposed to put this many words in a slide, but this is a glossary just so that you can refer back to it when I mention laws that you might not know. But just for a quick overview, when you ask people for money and they expect to get it back, that triggers securities laws. When you take people's money to lend or invest it and they definitely expect it back, that triggers banking and trust laws. When you routinely lend money to people and set the terms on how they pay it back, that triggers finance lender laws. Money transmission laws help the government crack down on money laundering. Insurance laws apply when you take people's money and they expect you to help them out of a mishap. And then when you pay someone money for a service, then that triggers a bunch of employment laws. So consumer finance is highly regulated. Depending on how your mutual aid group is set up, a lot of different laws could apply. And it's hard to justify having such strict laws apply to small groups of people just trying to help each other out. But the purpose of these laws is to protect us from big banks that are incentivized to exploit us. And those strict laws apply to us as well. And it's because things actually could go wrong. Even when the group starts out with folks with the best of intentions, What could go wrong? Well, there's a bunch. There could be fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, internal conflicts, money laundering. Many, many things can go wrong, which is why we have to bring up these regulations. And these regulations make us do a bunch of things like strict record keeping, paying filing fees, a lot of reporting to regulators, and even restraints on advertising. So just keep those in mind. So to make it easier, we recommend organizing groups that collect pledges or just bring people together to encourage peer-to-peer support. So instead of going through an organization, money would directly flow from one person to another. An example of this is one of the spreadsheets that emerged out of COVID-19. People put their names down, they put how much money they need and their Venmo account, and then people who can give just Venmo them. And it's as simple as that. And what's nice about this model, where individuals give directly to individuals, is that there is no intermediary being taxed. If you are a donor and you're donating more than $15,000 to an individual person, then you have to report that gift to the IRS. Sometimes that triggers a gift tax, but only for folks who have donated more than $11 million. So for almost all mutual aid purposes, where we're giving maybe just our stimulus checks directly to a person in need, we won't need to worry about the gift tax. You also don't have to pay the gift tax if you're giving money to pay for someone's medical expenses or for their educational expenses. But how do we organize mutual aid projects if we want to use this model where it's just peer-to-peer giving? There are many ways. As I said earlier, a mutual aid group can collect pledges. One example is Resource Generation, which is an organization that has collected more than 1,500 pledges for folks to donate stimulus checks to mutual aid projects and grassroots movements. Tomorrow, we at the Sustainable Economies Law Center are going to launch a pledge drive to redirect stimulus checks into cooperatives in the next economy. And we're not collecting the money, just the pledges, so that the resources will not pass through us, and that simplifies legal compliance for us. Under this model, mutual aid groups can also facilitate contracts between peers. Peers can also use guarantees to help lenders in their group feel more secure. A group can also streamline giving by creating an online platform. The virtual tip jar is a good example of a group facilitating this process. If you're following along in the slides, that's an actual link to the virtual tip jar, which you can click on. But we understand that sometimes people just don't trust strangers. And a lot of people really do just prefer giving a lump sum to a group that they trust. So let's talk about the model in which a group takes donations from individuals and then make donations to individuals. This ends up becoming an unincorporated association. So people form nonprofit unincorporated associations all the time, often without being aware of it. For example, if you and several of your neighbors get together to help raise funds to keep your local library branch open, you formed an unincorporated nonprofit association. If the gross income of your group is less than $5,000, you don't have to file for tax exemption, but you'd still be considered a nonprofit unincorporated association. We call them nano-profits because they're so little. Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code defines the term charitable. It includes relief of the poor, the distressed, or the underprivileged, advancement of religion, and advancement of education or science, lessening the burdens of government, lessening neighborhood tensions, eliminating prejudice and discrimination, defending human and civil rights secured by law, and combating community deterioration. Just note that even though you don't have to file for exemption, you have to file the 990 postcard each year. It's a super easy form, and the link is on this slide. One question we've received a lot is, can our mutual aid group be sued? And the answer is yes, depending on the structure of your group. Sometimes your entire group can be held liable and might have to pay damages from the funds of the group. Sometimes each individual member of your group can be held liable and pay for damages out of pocket. In one case, in Stewart v. Phelps, the court held that the 9 members of a small church may be held liable for the negligent operation of a car by one of its members. When the member was operating the vehicle for the association, and there was evidence that each member approved and authorized her operation of the vehicle for those purposes. Another case, Marshall v. International Longshoremen's Warehousemen's Union. In that case, the court held that an unincorporated labor union can be sued for the negligent acts of one of its members. This was a case in which a member of the group sued the group. So the uncertainty of who will be held liable if something bad happens might be enough for you to decide that actually you do want to form a nonprofit 501c3 and incorporate. And Charlotte will talk about how that would work. I'll hand it over to Charlotte. Stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Tia. So I will be sharing my screen, and bear with me a second here as I get my shared screen set up. All right. So as Tia mentioned, there are many benefits to doing the mutual aid through direct peer-to-peer giving because it does simplify legal compliance. And at the end of that section, she mentioned and talked about how people might prefer to give to a third party. In that instance, there can be you could achieve greater scale and momentum by giving to a third party. We've heard of, for example, nonprofits that have raised over $4 million in just the last month to then distribute to their communities. So what is the best approach if you want to have this third party intermediary? As we've already alluded, we do recommend using a nonprofit 501c3 or C4 corporation. And this is due to a number of benefits that a nonprofit corporation will provide. Just a note here, I want to clarify 2 different terminologies. So when creating a nonprofit corporation, there are 2 different steps that you'll have to take. The first is establishing the entity, and this is what will provide you with the legal liability shield that protects you and your personal assets from any lawsuits that are made against the entity, the mutual aid group. The second step to creating a nonprofit corporation is obtaining tax exemption. And this is where you go to the IRS or your state tax entity to request tax exemption. And you can get tax exemption while being unincorporated, and that's what Tia was talking about. You can also be a nonprofit corporation registered with the state and then not apply for tax exemption. So you can have one of these and not both, but moving forward, I'll be explaining these slides under the assumption that you want both and that you do have both. Also, generally, if you are a nonprofit organization, there are rules against creating excess private benefit to any one individual. In this time and instance, we are operating under a disaster. There is a disaster declaration that's been made for COVID. So organizations, including nonprofits, are able to create and give disaster relief payments under disaster relief grant exceptions. Essentially, they can do this without having to get permission from the IRS, even though typically there might be different rules that apply, including making sure that you're registered as a grant organization. So let's get right into it. So the tax exempt benefits come at 3 different junctures, starting with the donor giving payment to the intermediary. And one of the greatest benefits here is that the donor will get a tax deductible benefit. So that contribution that they made is deductible on their taxes. And typically this is only available to those people who itemize, usually wealthier folks, higher income, those with higher incomes that benefit from itemizing instead of taking the standard deduction. However, under the CARES Act, non-itemizers can also take advantage of this, and it's to the tune of $300. So if you give $300 to an organization that's a nonprofit that's providing COVID relief, then you can deduct that from your personal income taxes. So if we follow the money to the nonprofit, as I already said, the income is non-taxable to the nonprofit. That's a given or more obvious. If we follow it to the recipient, however, that's where it's a little bit more, there are more questions around how taxation works for the recipient. And Tia mentioned some of those. Tia mentioned that typically if it's a gift, then we can make an argument that it's non-taxable to the recipient. However, another way to guarantee that this is non-taxable is to, again, have it go through a nonprofit, because then it's going to be presumed to be a gift under the disaster relief payment rules. There are other benefits as well to being a nonprofit. So all those laws that Tia mentioned earlier, nonprofits tend to get exemptions from them. As an example, here in California, there are money transmitter laws where the money transmission is defined really broadly, and a nonprofit doesn't have to register as a money transmitter if it decides to move money from one organization to an individual. So that's a nice exemption to have for nonprofits. Other perks that a nonprofit that might have include perhaps having easier access to grants from foundations, and also the added benefit of perhaps being a legitimate organization that has formal procedures in place. And so if you're not already a nonprofit, there are a couple of ways to becoming one, especially in this time when people want to act quickly. Typically, the process involves filling out a really long form called Form 1023. And this is 28 pages long. It takes quite some time to fill out. But there is a way to expedite your request and the IRS might let you skip a line with this. There's no guarantees. However, you can do this if you can describe the immediate need that you're trying to fill. There is a shorter form of 1023. It's called 1023-EZ. It's 3 pages, and in my experience, takes about 4 weeks to turn around, if not less. And this is available to nonprofits that have $50,000 in gross receipts for the next 3 years, so smaller nonprofits. And I know nonprofits are the ones with less than $5,000 in income, as Tia talked about. And then finally, there's the fiscal sponsorship option, where you come under the umbrella of an established nonprofit organization. So the benefits here will be the same ones that we outlined in the previous slide, where the contribution will be tax deductible to the donor, and also the recipient will have that gift presumption for the money that they receive. The cons are that you will likely have to pay a fee to the sponsoring nonprofit, and you may have less control depending on the arrangement that you set up. So just to quickly review some of the fiscal sponsorship options out there, if you're not familiar with this already, they're typically organized under these different models, Model A, B, and C being the more common ones. So Model A is the most hands-on one, and where the project is highly controlled by the sponsoring nonprofit. On the flip side of that, you have the nonprofit, the sponsoring organization, taking on a lot of the administrative burdens. And the relationship between the project and the sponsoring organization here is that of an employer and employee. On the right side, you have the Model C. I'm going to skip Model B because I think Model C might be more relevant for mutual aid groups. So in Model C, the organization, the nonprofit organization that's sponsoring, is essentially acting as a conduit for grants and funding. And so here the project is fairly independent, has a lot more control than in Model A, and they will most likely have to set up their own bank account to keep track of all the funding that's coming in, and will have to do more of their record keeping. So all of those details should be fleshed out in a fiscal sponsorship agreement where the governance, decision-making processes are described, who's making decision on what, also management of the finances, and who's going to have control over branding of the project, intellectual property, and other matters of that ownership. So once you do have your nonprofit C3 or C4, just make sure you do check your bylaws to ensure that the activities for mutual aid fall within the nonprofit's purposes. You can amend it by following your bylaws if it's not already permitted. Make sure to keep records. I'll be talking more about this in the next few slides. And again, just to reemphasize, it will be ideal to have waivers of liability and disclosures in place. Worst case scenario here is that if you're collecting goods, someone might get sick. Again, just thinking of worst case scenarios here. It's also possible that, and one of the questions we've gotten here is, what if in the course of delivering groceries, the volunteer gets injured? Other ways to do this, to create some sort of legal liability, is again establishing that nonprofit corporation if you didn't already do that. And also hopefully you have general insurance in place. And if you are a grassroots organization, again, if you enter into a fiscal sponsorship, you can benefit from some of those established organizational precautions that the nonprofit organization sponsoring you might already have in place. So as far as record keeping is concerned, this is where a lot of the mutual aid, kind of the work for the mutual aid will come into play. The really important thing, if you're trying to maintain your tax exemption, is just keeping track of what it is that you're giving out, the date and place of the distribution, the costs of the aid, and the number of people that you think you've assisted. Now, there is this question of, do I need to create needs-based criteria? That is the person that I'm helping out someone that doesn't have the financial resources, otherwise are they in a charitable class? And that doesn't matter as much in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So compare this to, say, a wildfire, where after a fire, everyone receives blankets, water, shelter, but if an organization continues providing assistance, then they're going to have some eligibility criteria in place. Besides that, if you're going to provide long-term assistance, you should be tracking any potential conflicts, for example, relationships between the recipients and any officers, board of directors, and make sure that you are keeping track of your expenses so that you can report it on your 990 tax form, especially if it becomes one of your top 3 project expenses. There is this question also of whether nonprofits providing disaster relief can give to businesses, and the answer is yes. However, this is more greatly scrutinized, so it's important to have criteria and procedures in place such that you know when you're giving to businesses and you're consistent in applying those criteria, and when you're going to stop that aid. So at this point, I want to switch to maybe talking about loans instead of grants. And as I referenced earlier, California provides exemptions for nonprofits, and this includes exemptions for lending. And 501c3s actually are able to make loans to both for consumer or personal purposes as well as for commercial purposes, that is to businesses. And this works as long as the loans are in smaller amounts and they're not doing it frequently, so up to 35 loans. There are also ideas out there, and we don't have time to talk about this in great detail, but we can also have 501c3s, making sure that they have cash reserves to help each other out, or other co-ops in their community. But at this point, I'll hand it off to Sarah, who will talk more about investment funds.
Thanks. All right, I'm gonna, I wait for you, okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Is that working? You can all see the slides, right?
I think there's a lot. Someone actually just said the music is great. Just to let you know, there's
the music is great
music in the background.
Yeah, I got homeschool kids on the COVID-19 bingo, so I would have to like ask them to not practice tonight. We're gonna hear a little Suzuki at the same time as this. So, but you know what I didn't do right is that I cannot see the notes. And I'm not sure how to advance the slides. Sorry, we just practiced. Yeah, all right. I think I got it. All right. I'm going to talk about investment funds. Thanks for your patience. Because recently at a nextegg.org webinar, we were talking about moving your money into your local community instead of Wall Street. And immediately someone asked, how could we rapidly create a community fund for aggregating federal stimulus and folks' IRAs and 401ks in this moment to meet human needs from a next economy perspective? And immediately 2 more people said, I want to know the same thing. And then another person immediately said, and also what steps approach to take to organize myself, family, friends, etc., to move money into long-term local investments and off of Wall Street. And you know, there are a lot of people still working on saving enough money, having enough savings. And so there's certain amounts we can donate. And so this is in addition, yes, in my view, we should be providing direct financial solidarity if we know that we can meet our own needs and other folks can't. And then there's other money that we can't give away everything. We're trying to have savings. So what can we do with our savings? And so people have this question about how to invest together. So in this section, I'm specifically talking about investments that are designed to have a positive return on investment. So this is the same overview that we were looking at before, and I'm going to be talking about more of the bottom part of this slide. Quickest way, existing funds. This is a little outline of what I'm going to say. Existing funds, the only quick and easy ways to do it. And then I'm going to dig into some laws and some models for funds and next steps. The only really fast way to make investments that support your local community is to just participate in an existing fund. And there are existing funds, such as RSF Social Finance. It is a CDFI community development financial institution. Those are charitable loan funds, not nonprofit loan funds. RSF Social Finance focuses on social change. Sorry, I'm missing my notes here. But they make a lot of positive investments that basically I just got from looking at their Who We Fund page. So you may end up being happy with this. Their minimum investment is $1,000. Their interest rate that they offer is only 0.5%. Another example is Community Vision, which is the new name for Northern California Community Loan Fund. It used to be called NCCLF, now it's Community Vision. They have investment choices that you can participate in right now. Again, like right here where the picture cut off, individuals can invest a minimum of $1,000. Their return was a little bit higher, and they are also they're in the process of putting together a fund called the Real People's Fund that is specifically focused on entrepreneurs of color, and racial justice and economic justice in the Bay Area. So if you are happy with what an existing fund is doing, that would be a way to do it. And I have to give a shout out to EBPREC, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, As far as I know, their offering is still open. If that's not right, you can correct me, but it's not, it doesn't call itself a fund, but it's a way for you to invest in your community right now. So let's say that you feel that there's a gap or you want to be in charge of where the money is going. Here is what you can do other than an existing fund. Get together with your friends, you and your friends, find and discuss investments together, but no pooling. You each make your own investment. Each investment is separate. You make your own decision separately, and sometimes members of this network would negotiate different terms. So it's not, the word club sometimes means its own entity. The word fund implies pooling funds. So I'm not saying club or fund, I'm saying network. There is an example, as far as I know, the most well-known example is the Lion Network. I don't remember what LION stands for, I'm so sorry. But they have moved over several years, they have moved $3 million. So to me, that seems like they could make a difference with that. And that's something that, you know, if you're to start a network, you're not even worrying about what legal entity to be or securities laws or anything. It's you're totally on the other side, and whoever you're going to invest in, they're worrying about securities laws. This is the quickest and easiest path here. All right. Oh, sorry. I don't know how that got skipped, but here's the next, almost as quick and easy, not quite, the private investment club or fund. The gist of it, there is a lot of depth here. There's a lot of detail. So this is really an overview. An investment club, a private investment club has to be not more than 100 investors or members. No public offering of membership in the club. This strategy, I'm not giving you advice. I'm just telling you that this strategy only works if there is no public solicitation of joining this club. And once I started to think about the details of what the different strategies are, really choose a securities strategy and a 1940 Act strategy before you start, because you could easily think that you could have 100 investors or 99 investors, and as long as you reach them through word of mouth. That's not the case, because state securities laws actually weigh in here too. But I do want you to know that the strategy is available, and you may want to, if you pursue this, you would want to talk to a lawyer, but it's not as nearly as much legal work as the other models. All right, so now I'm gonna do an overview of why is this investment fund thing a big deal? Because of securities law. A security is any kind of investment contract where the investor is offered a return primarily from the efforts of others. For example, stocks and loans. I have a disclaimer on here. This is not legal advice for you. The general rule is that there's no offering or selling unregistered securities to the public. That means you need to register or find an exemption. And there are federal and state laws. There's securities laws at both levels. They overlap. And just to give you kind of a sense of what the scale of these things, at Cutting Edge Counsel, we help folks register public offerings. Some public offerings don't need to be registered because some exemptions allow for public offering. That's what EB-PREC is doing. But if you don't have one of those convenient exemptions, to offer publicly, you need to register. To do that could cost $15,000 at the very low end. It can cost maybe $30,000 or more, and those things tend to be dealing with a lot of complexity, a lot of audited financial statements is what would make those fees go up. At the federal level, a registration is an IPO, and that can cost $1 million. So what we do is find a federal exemption, and then either exemption or registration at the state level. All right, maybe I'll try for a little bit less detail. This is going to be an overview. So in addition to securities laws, to sum up the securities law part, don't take your investment opportunity and just offer it publicly without a strategy. And the Investment Company Act of 1940 is an exciting thing that we have to deal with. Offering securities, an issuer is someone who offers securities, plus investing in other securities equals investment company. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. If I go and solicit folks to put their stimulus checks into a fund, and then we go and buy stock in local businesses, that's an investment company. And that leads to regulation. And the regulation, basically, there are requirements that make being a registered investment company, the requirements make it inaccessible. And the reporting requirements also are extremely burdensome. So instead, we look for exemptions. Okay, this is the little CLE part. An investment company means any issuer which is or holds itself out as being primarily in the business of investing in securities, or is engaged or proposes to engage in the business of investing, trading in securities, and owns or proposes to acquire investment securities having a value exceeding 40% of its total assets. So how do you not be an investment company? One way of not being an investment company is being a holding company. Because securities issued by majority-owned subsidiaries of the issuer. So if you're a company, you have a subsidiary, you own the subsidiary stock, that stock doesn't count as securities for the definition of investment company. So here, the A part of the definition is we want to be an investment fund. We're an investment fund. Hey, everybody, this is what we're doing. We're investing. C is we're just engaging in some business. And in reality, we hold securities. But the securities of our subsidiaries don't count. So that means that the holding company could have subsidiaries that are 60% of its assets, and the other 40% could be invested in anything else, like minority positions in companies that this group wants to support. And there are some examples of this. They weren't conceived, well, the example I'm thinking of wasn't conceived as an investment company. What it is a co-op, umbrella co-op. So my client, O'Brien Cooperative, formerly known as the Staffing Cooperative, its purpose is to start and acquire companies to convert them into worker cooperative. Oh, sorry, the subsidiaries are not worker cooperatives. All of the employees of the subsidiary are members of the umbrella co-op. So it's creating worker-owned jobs. But this is, anytime that they raise capital, they're not an investment company because they're a holding company. If you were to invest in this co-op, there wouldn't be a 40 Act issue. Right, so a community investment fund can use 60% of its assets to own majority-owned subsidiaries, 40% of its assets to invest in other things. Oh, look, I hear the examples. Okay, so this is the one I just talked about, O'Brien Cooperative. It has a purpose of creating employee-owned jobs. It's not actually a fund. And this is an example that I read about where somebody created this fund to purchase businesses that would otherwise close. And what it does is actually run those businesses. All right, here's another exemption. Notwithstanding the definition of investment company, none of the following is an investment company. Any issuer primarily engaged in a business or businesses other than that of investing. So translation is, this is a company that does something else. And a great example of that is a food co-op. Hot tip, food co-ops can start funds. Most of the assets are the food co-op's assets. 40% or less can be members' investments that are used for however the fund wants to support their local economy. The La Montañita Fund is a cool example in New Mexico. All right, so now we're stepping up from first we looked at how to avoid being defined as an investment company. Now I'm going to look at one of the exemptions, the charitable loan fund. So any company organized and operated exclusively, blah, blah, blah. This is 501c3 language. So Charlotte was talking about how charities are exempt from a lot of different laws. This is one of them. This is why a lot of the community supporting funds out there are organized as charities, because you can organize one and not be regulated as an investment company. Many exist already. There's a downside, which is that charities cannot split profits with their investors. So it ends up being that they can only offer loans. They can only make loans. They have to, the cash flow gets hard because they have to bring in enough cash to cover the loans that they made to investors. And it has to be an interest rate and not profit sharing. So that's the downside of the charitable loan fund, but compliance is a lot easier. And those are all of my models. That was a really quick overview. I'm just going to say the disclaimer that once you start to dig in and figure out what strategy you want to use, there will be a lot more questions and there's a lot more detail there. So here's some next steps that I thought of. If you know that you want to do a private network, if you know that you want to invest rather than donate a stimulus check or anything else, talking to other interested people could just be the first step. You could research together. The thing I'm worried about is if I want to get together with other investors to support my local food system, and I know that if I find a business that needs money, but they don't have any business plan or any documents, what can I do to help those farmers get investment ready? Because I know they're going to need that. That's part of the whole picture of what they say is impact investing or community investing. Some other next steps are learn about the seed commons. That's a way the working world is helping to set up local investment networks or clubs. I have not internalized all the details, but here's the link. And then, okay, this guide, the Community Investment Fund Handbook, has recently been published by NC3 National Coalition for Community Capital, and my colleague Brian Becken wrote this chapter, sorry, not chapter 2, he wrote the legal chapter. But chapter 2 is called Steps to Create a Community Investment Fund. So the next steps, I think, are to read chapter 2 and 80 pages of this handbook, because if you're gonna start a fund, that is a hard thing to do, and you should first read an 80-page guide. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we do have time for Janelle to share some information about 501c8s, because that was a question we received in the chat. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Janelle Orsi from Sustainable Economies Law Center. Since someone asked about 501c8s, I thought that would be a good moment to talk about entity level taxation in general and just why that's important. I'm going to share my, oh, if you can let me share my screen, or Tia, if you could share slides 78 and 79, either way. Yeah, so basically there's all these kinds of tax exemptions where if people take their money, like a whole bunch of people take their money and then they pool it for some purpose that's meant to benefit them, it would be kind of unfair if then the entity where they pool it has to pay tax on that. Because it's just the fact that they're pooling it shouldn't make it, you know, be a taxable event. And so the IRS has created all these silly, I think they're silly, tax categories for different types of ways that people pool their funds for their benefit. And then one of them is 501c8s, but it's so unique to the historical structures in the United States of these societies that come together where people pool money for like life insurance and health and all that, but they're also fraternal, meaning they have ceremonies and rituals and quote unquote regalia. That's why I did that little cartoon there. They also, the people involved have to have some common pursuit, like they're all Masons or something. And they have to operate on under a lodge system, meaning there has to be kind of like a network of multiple similar ones. So if you go around the country, you see like these local Elks and Moose Lodge and all that. That's what that is. But I find them to be so weird as to be somewhat strange to try to fit yourself into that box. And if you go to the next slide, if like the main purpose is to be able to versus 79. If the main purpose is to be able to pool resources, oh, it's 80, slide 80. It's not there. So you just need to find a tax category that prevents the entity from having to pay taxes. And there's 501c7s, but those have to be like groups of people who come together, at least in part, for fun and social activities. If it's not fun, you can't actually get tax exemption, literally. That's the IRS's stance on it. There's 501c12s, which are another kind of similar mutual benefit activity, like life insurance, digging ditches for your friends, like activities, as if like this collection of activities under C12 is like a coherent list of things. But like again, the idea is to just prevent taxes when people are engaging in mutual benefit activities. But subchapter T, that's the tax category that applies to most kinds of cooperatives. The entity itself sometimes pays taxes, but that's only if you take people's money and don't plan to distribute it back out to them on the basis of patronage. I hope that was helpful. That was a little bit on the fly.
Awesome. Thank you, Janelle. That was super impressive because you just made those slides while we were presenting.
I got excited.
So thank you. Okay, well, now it's the time for breakout groups. And I'm going to have to ask you all to bear with us because this is the first time we've had a legal cafe in this format. We have 15 lawyers to provide legal information to everyone in this meeting. That means we do not have the capacity for individualized consultations like we usually do. And we will break into 5 rooms with these special themes. So please read these themes and choose one. Once you choose a room, please let me know by changing your name to a room number. Then we will manually put you into a breakout room because unfortunately on Zoom, you can't just choose to go into a breakout room. The host has to let you go in, has to put you in. And so please change your name. And if you are a lawyer, one of our volunteer lawyers, please put the name lawyer and the room that you want to be in. Once you're in the breakout room, the lawyers will introduce themselves and they will collect your questions and then try to answer them. If it's too hard to decide what breakout room to